There comes a moment in history when silence is no longer strength, and partnerships built on convenience begin to crumble under the weight of principle. India, a land older than time itself, has stood tall through empires, invasions, and negotiations. But today, it chooses something far more dangerous than warg independence of thought. This isn't about a trade deal, a treaty, or a photo op. No. This is about reclaiming a voice that will no longer be silenced by foreign interests. About a nation that finally looked west and said, "We've had enough." The final breakup between India and the United States isn't just about policy. It's about dignity, direction, and destiny. And in this moment, a new era begins. The question is not whether the world is ready for this India. India's strategic shift from dependence to dominance, the collapse of diplomatic illusions, economic sovereignty over Western influence, the rise of a multipolar world order, a call for national pride, unity, and global leadership. India's strategic shift from dependence to dominance is not a sudden turn, but a carefully calculated move built over decades of observation, resistance, and transformation. For years, India engaged in alliances and partnerships with global superpowers, not out of helplessness, but out of the practical need to integrate with a world order that was never designed with its interests at heart. The United States, as a global hegemon, offered military cooperation, economic opportunities, and political influence, but often at the price of compromise. And India, still emerging from the shadows of colonial rule, played the game as it was written. But behind closed doors, something deeper was taking shape. India began to realize that true power does not come from sitting at the table. It comes from building your own. The foundations were laid through technology, education, defense, self-reliance, and most importantly, the will to no longer be dictated by foreign narratives. As the world turned, India watched. It watched how promises turned to pressure, how friendship was often transactional, and how sovereignty was subtly challenged in the name of cooperation. Trade policies were tilted, defense deals came with strings, and global institutions under Western influence continued to view India through a narrow lens, so India adapted. It stopped waiting for validation and started designing its own roadmap. The rise of indigenous defense technologies, the growth of a digital economy that could rival any Western power, and the firm stance on global issues without yielding to superpower bias. These were not isolated events. These were markers of a new mindset, one that refused to play second fiddle to anyone. As the world moved into crisis after crisis, wars, recessions, and fractured alliances, India stayed its course, and that consistency, that discipline, became its greatest asset. Strategic shift means more than changing partners or policies. It means rewriting the rules of engagement. India began to form new alliances, not out of need, but out of vision. Whether it was BRICS, the Quad, or South-South cooperation, India ensured that its voice was not just present, but powerful. No longer a silent observer, it became a shaper of dialogue, a disruptor of the old balance, and a symbol of emerging leadership. The decision to step away from certain ties with the U.S. was not born from anger or arrogance. It was born from clarity. Clarity that India no longer needs to be carried. It needs to lead. Clarity that soft diplomacy backed by economic dependency is a hollow victory. And clarity that global respect cannot be bought. It must be earned by the courage to walk alone when necessary. This transformation wasn't possible without pain. Every step toward dominance came with internal resistance, international pushback, and moments of doubt. But India endured. It realized that the road to sovereignty is long and often lonely. But it is the only road that leads to true power, a power that is not defined by military bases or foreign investment alone, but by the ability to say no, to define its own path without waiting for approval from Washington or Brussels. India's strategic autonomy today is not an act of defiance. It is an act of maturity. It sends a message to the world that alliances must be equal, partnerships must be respectful, and no nation, however powerful, has the right to dictate another's future. In choosing dominance over dependence, India didn't just shift gears. It shifted the global narrative. And now, as it looks inward to strengthen and outward to lead, the world must adjust its lens. The days of India being seen as a developing market or a strategic pawn are over. This is a nation that builds its own satellites, secures its borders with indigenous systems, and negotiates on the world stage with its head held high. The breakup with the United States is symbolic. It marks the end of one-sided diplomacy and the beginning of mutual accountability. It shows that while friendships may be valued, self-respect is non-negotiable. The shift is real. It is powerful, and it is permanent. India is no longer asking to be heard. It is speaking clearly and confidently. No longer following, it's leading. And no longer depending, it's dominating. The world would do well to recognize this shift not as a threat, but as the emergence of a force that can no longer be ignored. Because India has stepped into its power, not just geographically or economically, but strategically. And there's no turning back. The collapse of diplomatic illusions between India and the United States didn't happen in one press conference or one failed summit. It unraveled slowly, silently, behind the staged handshakes and public affirmations of partnership. For decades, both nations portrayed their relationship as one of mutual respect and shared democratic values. But beneath the surface, there existed a growing disconnect, one that became too wide to ignore. India, with its deep-rooted cultural identity and centuries of resilience, saw through the polished promises and began to question the authenticity of a bond that often felt more transactional than transformational. At the heart of the disillusionment was a pattern, one that repeated itself across trade deals, defense negotiations, and global decision-making forums. While the United States extended support, it came laced with conditions. Every partnership seemed to benefit Washington more than New Delhi. The language of equality was spoken, but the actions rarely reflected it. India was expected to align with Western geopolitical interests, often at the cost of its own regional priorities. It was urged to take sides in conflicts it did not start, to support sanctions it did not believe in, and to welcome policies that diluted its sovereignty in the name of cooperation. The illusion of being a strategic ally began to fade as India realized that true allies listen, respect, and reciprocate. What it often received was pressure to conform, whether in matters of trade tariffs, energy purchases, or foreign policy alignment. The pushback against independent decisions, such as purchasing defense equipment from non-Western partners or refusing to condemn nations based on external agendas, became louder. It was clear that the partnership was conditional, and India, proud and sovereign, does not bend easily to conditions. The diplomatic fallout was not loud. It didn't explode, it eroded. It showed itself in subtle shifts, fewer high-level visits, more public disagreements, and the erosion of trust that had once been carefully built. The tipping point came when India chose its national interests over American expectations, again and again. And each time it did, the mask of mutual understanding slipped a little more. What India understood, perhaps better than many, was that diplomacy without respect is manipulation. That friendship built on compliance is not friendship at all. And that no amount of aid, investment, or praise can replace the dignity of being treated as an equal. The illusions collapsed the moment India stopped trying to meet expectations that were never designed with its success in mind. It stopped playing the polite partner and started speaking with clarity, even when that clarity disturbed the global status quo. India's refusal to follow scripted narratives created discomfort in diplomatic circles that had grown accustomed to its quiet accent. When it spoke out against global hypocrisy, when it refused to pick sides in polarized conflicts, when it asserted its right to energy security, technological development, and border integrity without external validation, the mirage of alliance shattered. And in its place, a new, raw truth emerging. India would no longer play a role in someone else's power play. This collapse was necessary. Sometimes illusions must fall for real understanding to rise. India is not a country that thrives on conflict, but it will not shy away from confrontation when values are compromised. It gave diplomacy its full chance, year after year, but it refused to continue under the weight of one-sided expectations. In stepping away from the illusion, India reclaimed the power to define its own global identity. And what emerged was not isolation, but clarity. India is not anti-West, anti-US, or anti-global. It is pro-India. And in a world increasingly defined by self-interest, it has every right to prioritize its people, its growth, and its vision. That's not nationalism. It's realism. A realism that no longer entertains the myth that all allies are equal, or that friendship must come at the cost of freedom. The collapse of diplomatic illusions is not the end of diplomacy. It is the beginning of honest dialogue, one where India enters the room not as a junior partner, but as a global force with its own voice. A voice that doesn't echo someone else's script, but speaks with authenticity. A voice that challenges the imbalance of old partnerships and dares to demand fairness. A voice that will not be silenced by economic pressure, political threats, or global narratives that try to paint independence as rebellion. India's path is clear. It will engage with the world on its own terms. It will partner without surrender, negotiate without fear, and lead without apology. The collapse of illusions wasn't a failure. It was a liberation, and from that freedom, a new India rises. Stronger, wiser, and unafraid to walk away from alliances that no longer serve its truth.
Economic sovereignty over Western influence is not just a policy, it is a mindset, a declaration that a nation's prosperity will no longer be dictated by foreign hands. For decades, India's economy was intertwined with Western institutions, corporations, and currencies. Aid, investment, and trade agreements came wrapped in the language of support, but they often carried quiet terms of control. Subtle leverage was applied through financial dependencies, and decisions that affected millions of Indian lives were sometimes swayed by pressure from across ocean. But that chapter is closing, and a new one is being written, one where India stands firmly on its own economic legs. The journey toward economic sovereignty did not begin with a loud announcement. It began with choices. India started investing in self-reliance, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. It realized that in a global system where power is often exercised through money, the key to freedom lies in controlling your own economy. This meant building domestic industries, encouraging innovation, and reducing reliance on imports for essentials like defense equipment, energy, and technology. It meant prioritizing the Make in India movement, not just as a slogan, but as a strategy to reclaim control. Western influence often operates through dependency. When a nation is dependent on another for weapons, oil, infrastructure, or digital frameworks, it becomes vulnerable. A shift in foreign policy, a change in leadership, or a new sanction can bring everything to a standstill. India recognized this fragility and decided it would no longer place its economic future in the hands of powers that do not share its vision or respect its autonomy. Instead of begging for inclusion in global trade blocs, it began to craft its own terms of engagement. Instead of chasing foreign capital, it started cultivating domestic investment and regional cooperation. This shift wasn't about rejecting the West. It was about prioritizing India, about ensuring that every loan, every trade deal, and every partnership served the interests of the Indian people first. India became more selective, more deliberate, and more courageous in saying no to proposals that demanded too much and offered too little. It challenged the outdated belief that Western economic models were the gold standard and began crafting a model rooted in its own culture, needs, and ambitions. In doing so, India also began redefining power. Power no longer meant how many foreign investors were lining up at your door. It meant how little you needed them to survive. True strength was no longer measured by how well you followed the rules set by others, but by how effectively you could rewrite those rules for your own people. India started to invest in its own currency stability, digital payment systems, renewable energy, and agricultural independence. These weren't isolated moves. They were strategic blows to the economic influence that had long shaped its policies. And with this shift came resistance. Western nations, used to having influence through their corporations, think tanks, and multinational platforms, were uncomfortable with India's assertiveness. Pressure increased, covert and overt, to remain aligned with their financial systems and ideological preferences. India faced criticism, economic threats, and even diplomatic isolation at times. But it stood its ground, because sovereignty is not for sale, and dignity cannot be traded for convenience. The power of economic independence is that it gives a nation the strength to act in alignment with its values. India no longer needs to compromise its policies to protect foreign investments. It no longer has to sacrifice long-term national goals for short-term international approval. With each new initiative aimed at local manufacturing, with every step toward energy independence, and with every deal done in rupees instead of dollars, India breaks another chain of dependency. This is not a rejection of globalization, but a reclamation of control within. India is still open for trade, investment, and collaboration, but on equal footing. It will no longer be a marketplace to exploit. It will be a partner to respect. Western influence may still exist, but it no longer defines the trajectory of India's economy. That power now belongs to India. Its economic sovereignty is not a destination, it's an ongoing commitment. A commitment to protect, nurture, and prioritize the national interest above all else. It requires resilience, discipline, and the courage to walk alone when necessary. India has shown all three, and as it moves forward, it does so with a clear message that its economy is no longer a branch of someone else's empire. It is the foundation of its own. The rise of a multipolar world order is no longer a prediction. It is a reality unfolding in real time, and India is right at its center. For too long, global power was concentrated in the hands of a few nations, primarily in the West, who dictated the terms of diplomacy, economy, and military strategy. Their voices echoed the loudest in international institutions. Their values became the standard, and their interests often overshadowed those of developing nations. But the balance is shifting. A world once shaped by a singular narrative is now opening to many. India is not just adapting to this shift, it is helping shape it. India's foreign policy, once characterized by cautious neutrality, has evolved into one of confident assertiveness. It is no longer content to be a spectator in global affairs or a follower of dominant power. Instead, it is emerging as a bridge between East and West, North and South. This positioning is not accidental, it is strategic. It recognizes that the world is too complex, too interconnected, and too diverse to be governed by one or two superpowers. The future belongs to a world where power is distributed, where different centers of influence coexist, and where regional powers rise to global significance. India's role in this emerging structure is grounded in its ability to engage with multiple powers without being dominated by any. It maintains strong ties with the United States, but it also partners with Russia, collaborates with China when necessary, and builds deep relations across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This balancing act is not weakness, it's wisdom. It shows India's ability to navigate a complex global environment with clarity and composure. It refuses to be dragged into Cold War-style binaries. It doesn't pick sides based on pressure. It makes decisions based on principle and long-term vision. This multipolar rise also brings a more equitable voice to the global South, a region that has long been sidelined in decision-making, but bears the brunt of global consequences. From climate change to economic inequality, India is becoming the voice for these nations, not as a savior, but as a representative of shared struggles and shared ambition. Through platforms like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and G20 leadership, India advocates for financial reforms, climate justice, technology transfer, and inclusive development. It challenges the old systems and proposes alternatives that reflect the realities of today, not the power dynamics of a century ago. This shift is not just about diplomacy, it is about narrative. The West has long controlled the stories told about progress, security, democracy, and development. But as new powers rise, so do new perspectives. India brings to the table a civilizational wisdom, a democratic depth, and a developmental model that stands apart from the Western blueprint. It doesn't seek to replace one empire with another. It seeks to restore balance to a world that has been tilted for far too long. As this new era takes shape, resistance is inevitable. Established powers do not give up control easily. There will be attempts to undermine, isolate, or distract. But India is prepared. Its strength lies not in loud declarations, but in consistent, quiet progress. It has built alliances through trust, not coercion. It has gained respect by standing firm, not by bowing down. And it has proven that influence can be earned, not just through power but through principle. This rise is not a competition, it is a correction, a necessary one. The world needs more than a handful of voices deciding the fate of billions. It needs diversity of thought, culture, and experience at the highest levels of decision-making. A multipolar world offers that possibility, and India is playing a central role in making it real. It does so not with aggression, but with ambition, not with dominance, but with dignity. India's emergence in this new order is a symbol of what's possible when a nation commits to independence without isolation, engagement without submission, and leadership without arrogance. It is showing that you can rise without mimicking, lead without bullying, and influence without exploiting. This is the kind of power the world needs now. not just strong but stable, not just bold but balanced. The multipolar world is not coming, it is already here, and India is not merely participating, it is shaping the future. One decision, one alliance, one stand at a time. As this order evolves, India's position will not just be recognized, it will be respected, because it has earned that place, not through legacy, but through vision, and that vision is no longer waiting to be accepted, it is leading the way. A call for national pride, unity, and global leadership is not merely a speech, it is a rallying cry that echoes through generations. In times of uncertainty, when alliances shift and global dynamics change, a nation must turn inward before it can lead outward. India, standing at the edge of a historic transformation, understands this better than most. As the old structures fall away and a new world takes shape, what binds the nation together is not just policy or politics, it is pride in who it is, unity in what it stands for, and a shared determination to lead with integrity on the world stage. National pride is not arrogant. It is not a loud proclamation or a blind sense of superiority. It is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your roots, your history, and your potential. For India, pride is etched in the knowledge that this land has given the world wisdom, science, spirituality, and resilience across centuries. It is found in the sacrifices of freedom fighters, in the ingenuity of its entrepreneurs, and in the endurance of its people. Pride means refusing to be defined by colonial narratives, foreign ratings, or superficial praise from abroad. It means owning the narrative, rewriting it in your own voice, and celebrating what makes you distinct rather than diluted. Unity is the foundation that makes pride powerful. A nation as diverse as India cannot afford division, not when it is poised to lead. From its languages to its religions, its regions to its ideologies, India is a tapestry of contrasts. But true unity is not the absence of difference, it is the ability to march forward despite them. India's strength lies in its democracy, in its ability to argue, disagree, and still move as one. When internal conflicts are set aside for national progress, when regional interests are balanced with collective goals, and when people begin to see each other not as competitors but as fellow custodians of a common future, that is unity in action. It is the invisible thread that binds the farmer in Punjab with the engineer in Bangalore, the teacher in Kerala with the soldier in Ladakh. And in that unity lies unshakable strength. With pride and unity, leadership becomes not just a possibility, it becomes a responsibility. India can no longer afford to play small on the global stage. The world is watching, and more importantly, waiting for a nation that doesn't just follow global agendas, but defines them. A nation that doesn't echo the voice of others but speaks with its own clarity and purpose. Global leadership in India's hands is not about dominance, it is about example, about showing that you can rise through peace, progress, and principle, that you can be powerful without being oppressive, and visionary without being imperial. This leadership starts with internal strength, economic resilience, technological innovation, cultural revival, and strategic clarity, but it also depends on how India treats its people, its neighbors, and its environment. The world is looking not just at how India negotiates treaties, but how it uplifts its citizens, not just how it responds to threats, but how it creates opportunities. The leadership India offers must be moral, inclusive, and future-facing. That is what separates a rising power from a responsible power. But this moment demands more than plans and policies. It demands belief, the kind of belief that is contagious, the kind that inspires a generation to study harder, work smarter, and serve deep, the kind of belief that tells the world, India is ready, not because someone else says so, but because it knows so. This belief, once seated in every citizen, will grow into a national consciousness too strong to be ignored. This call to pride, unity, and leadership is not made in anger or desperation. It is made in clarity. India has nothing to prove to the world, but everything to offer. And what it offers must begin at home, with a renewed sense of purpose, a refusal to settle for mediocrity, and a willingness to carry the burden of leadership with humility. As global powers shift, as old alliances fade, and as new challenges arise, India stands at the doorway of possibility, not to follow,
not to imitate, but to lead with its own voice, values and vision, and that leadership will not be granted, it must be claimed, with pride, with unity, and with unwavering belief in the path ahead. The world doesn't need another superpower, it needs a nation that leads differently, and India is answering that call. And so, as the dust settles on old alliances, and the silence grows louder between former partners, a new voice rises from the east, not in anger, not in defiance, but in quiet, unwavering confidence. India's final breakup with the United States is not an end, it is an arrival at a place of self-assurance, where decisions are made not out of obligation, but out of vision, where friendships are welcomed, but never at the cost of sovereignty, where dialogue is encouraged, but never under pressure. This moment marks the beginning of something greater than separation. It is the birth of a new era, an era where India steps forward, not with borrowed strength, but with its own, not chasing seats at someone else's table, but building one worthy of all. It is the era of economic independence, strategic clarity, and unapologetic leadership. The illusions have fallen, the masks removed, and what remains is truth, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. India will lead, not by force, but by example, not by submission to foreign interests, but by service to its people. It will speak its mind, protect its ground, and forge its future on its terms. The world will watch, some in awe, others in discomfort, but all will have to listen, because India is not waiting anymore. It is moving forward, and the world will follow.